All right, let's jump right in. Today we're going to be dissecting this Infernalist Witch Minion Build guide for Path of Exile 2.
Yeah, this one looks pretty intense. Lots to unpack here.
Path of Exile 2, for anyone new to the game, is an action RPG where you can really customize your characters. And this particular build is all about building up this army of minions to do the fighting for you.
A classic strategy, and for good reason. But this guide takes it to another level, focusing on the Infernalist, which is an Ascendancy for the Witch class.
Okay, so Ascendancy, that's where things get really interesting.
Right, you're essentially specializing your character even further, unlocking unique powers and abilities that really shape your playstyle.
And this guide focuses on 4 specific Ascendancy nodes within that Infernalist tree that make this build tick. First one up is Altered Flesh. So normally you'd be worried about incoming damage.
Right.
But this actually turns that damage into a strength, taking a portion of that cold, lightning, or physical damage you take and converting it into fire damage.
Pretty clever. It plays into the Infernalist's strength and makes you a lot tougher to kill, especially early on.
Now the next 3, Bite Its Will, Gaze, and Hand. These are really interesting because they all come with a bit of a trade-off. Each one reserves a portion of your life, but in return, they give you some hefty bonuses to your spirit, mana, and energy shield.
This is where the build gets a little risky, but also really powerful. You're essentially trading some raw health to supercharge your ability to cast spells and maintain strong defenses through that energy shield.
High risk, high reward, right?
Exactly.
It sounds like resource management's going to be super important here. All right, let's dig into the skill gems. This is where it gets really fun. These are like the building blocks of your abilities and Path of Exile 2, and the combinations are pretty much endless.
Yeah, this guide recommends a pretty specific set of skill gems to maximize the build's effectiveness. It starts with your primary damage source, which is Arc, and this is outside of the minions, obviously.
Arc. I love Arc. It's that classic chaining lightning spell, just decimating mobs of enemies because it gets stronger with each chain.
Yeah, the guide talks about why the chosen support gems are so important here. Added lightning damage, that one's pretty self-explanatory, just adds more damage. Then there's lightning penetration, so your lightning can cut through those enemy resistances. Shock chance to amplify that damage even further, and chain to make the arc bounce even more times.
It's all about that chain reaction.
For sure.
Now, there's also a secondary damage source, Contagion. This chaos spell is all about, well, spreading chaos. It rapidly spreads from enemy to enemy as they die, inflicting that nasty damage over time.
And the support gems here are all about amplifying that spread and damage over time. Swift Affliction speeds up that chaos damage. Poison Chance adds another layer of damage over time. Chaos Mastery bumps up the gem level. Spell Echo for faster spreading. And Hinder to slow those enemies down, giving your minions the upper hand.
All right, time for the main event. The minions themselves. Summon skeletons. That's got to be the heart of this build, right?
Yeah, these are your trusty skeletal warriors dishing out that consistent damage and keeping the enemies distracted.
And I see the guide recommends 3 support gems. Feeding Frenzy to make them even more aggressive. Minion Instability to turn those skeletons into little walking bombs when they die. And Essence Harvest to give you some mana back when a minion bites the dust.
It's a good mix of offense and sustain.
We've also got Raise Zombie to summon some beefy undead buddies to protect you and the rest of your crew.
Yep, this is where those tanky boys come in. And the support gems here really play into that role. Meat Shield to taunt and absorb damage. Last Gasp gives them one last hurrah even after they die. Elemental Army strengthens their elemental resistance. And then there's Minion Mastery to make those zombies tougher overall.
Talk about an undead wall. Now we also have Unearth. I always love this skill. Summoning those bone constructs that just explode for a burst of damage.
Short-lived, but powerful. And the support gems really make those explosions count. Spell Echo gives you twice the bone constructs. Concentrated Effect tightens that area of effect for even more damage. Faster casting is a must-have for summoning them more often. And the guide mentions that the last 2 slots are flexible. You can either use increased duration for longer-lasting constructs, or controlled destruction.
Nice. Now, Bind Spectre. This one's always fascinating to me. This is where you can actually capture the spirits of certain monsters and gain their ability.
It's a really cool way to add a lot of customization to your build. You can pick specters that boost your minion damage or survivability, or even those that give you some unique utility depending on your playstyle. Think of it like recruiting specialists for your undead army.
Love it. We've got the Ascendancy nodes, we've got the core skill gems. But what about auras and curses? These are those passive buffs and debuffs that constantly affect you and your enemies. Now, Herald of Ash, that's an interesting choice. Adds fire damage to attacks and can trigger those fiery explosions.
It fits really well with this build. You've got Altered Flesh, converting damage to fire, and a lot of fire-based attacks already. Herald of Ash just makes that synergy even stronger.
And to make those enemies really feel the burn, we've got Flammability. That's a curse that reduces their resistance to fire damage.
But instead of casting it manually, the guide suggests using Blasphemy as a support gem. So it basically turns Flammability into an aura. It's all about that damage.
Okay, so we got the foundation. What should we be focusing on in those early game stages?
Definitely prioritize getting Altered Flesh as soon as you can. That's going to make a huge difference in your survivability early on. Leveling those core skills too, obviously. Arc, Contagion, Summon Skeletons, and Raise Zombie. Got to get those rolling.
And to stay alive in those early encounters, looks like the guide recommends Arctic Armor for some added protection. Makes sense. What about those mid to late game stages?
That's where Bite Its Will really starts to shine. That's when you'll really feel the power of those minions. But optimizing your gear and support gems becomes really important at that point. You need to find that balance between damage and survivability.
So it's not just about stacking as much damage as possible.
Not necessarily. You've got to be able to take a hit too. And remember about that resource management, finding that balance with spirit reservation for those auras and still having enough mana for spells and defenses.
It's a balancing act for sure. So how do we actually use this build in combat? What are the tactics?
The guide suggests a pretty deadly combo. Weaken those enemies with Contagion, then blast them with Arc for that chain lightning, and all while strategically positioning those minions for maximum impact.
I can picture it now. Skeletons on the front line, zombies soaking up damage, a few well-placed unearth explosions, and the whole battlefield's just erupting in flames thanks to Herald of Ash and Flammability.
Beautiful, isn't it? But to really master this build, you got to play around with those support gems and experiment with different minion combinations to see what works best for you.
So there's still room for personal flair within this framework.
Oh, absolutely. Path of Exile 2 is all about customization. The guide's a great starting point, but you make it your own. So what about gearing up for this build? What should we be looking for?
Looks like the guide really emphasizes gear with high life, resistances, especially fire resistance, and anything that can help us stay alive while still dishing out the pain.
And don't be afraid to experiment with different minion combinations as you level up. Find what feels right.
Okay, so to sum it all up, this Infernalist Witch build is all about summoning a massive army of minions, wielding fire and chaos to obliterate your enemies, and managing your resources to stay alive.
Yeah, it's a really unique and potentially super powerful way to play Path of Exile 2, and we've only scratched the surface.
Ooh, I like where this is going. What other insights are hiding in this guide? Let's dive even deeper.
So we were just talking about how this Infernalist Witch build is a powerful way to play Path of Exile 2.
Right. But like anything, there are always challenges, especially in Path of Exile 2.
Absolutely.
So as you go up those higher difficulty tiers, what are some things we need to be mindful of with this build?
Well, one of the biggest things is enemy damage scaling, right? As you progress, those monsters are going to hit harder and harder.
Right.
And even with Altered Flesh and a strong energy shield, a good wall of zombies, you can still get overwhelmed.
Yeah, that makes sense. Especially since we're reserving a good chunk of our life pool for those Bidats bonuses.
Yeah.
Are there any enemies in particular that this build might struggle against? I mean, more than others.
Yeah, I think anything that can bypass energy shield is always going to be a threat. Or deal heavy chaos damage.
Right.
Those are the ones you really need to watch out for.
So how do we adapt to that? I mean, gear choices seem like an obvious place to start.
Yeah, gear's huge. You're going to want to prioritize gear with high life, increased energy shield, and good resistances, especially to those damage types we just talked about.
Right.
You might even have to sacrifice some damage for survivability.
Right, yeah.
Sometimes staying alive is more important than squeezing out that little bit of extra damage.
Makes sense. Are there any other tricks we can use to boost our defenses?
Well, remember those specters.
Yeah.
They can be a real lifesaver, literally.
Yeah.
Choosing specters that provide defensive buffs to your minions can make a huge difference.
Oh, right. Specters that grant increased life regeneration, or maybe even temporary invulnerability to certain damage types. That would be huge. But Path of Exile 2 always has another trick up its sleeve, right? Those map modifiers.
Ah, yeah, map modifiers. They can really throw a wrench in the works.
Right.
You got to be adaptable.
Yeah, I'm thinking of those reflect maps where your attacks bounce back at you.
Oh, yeah,
That can be a nightmare for minion builds.
absolutely.
What do we do in those situations?
Well, for reflect maps, you might have to swap out some of your support gems for those that reduce reflected damage.
Right.
Or even think about changing your damage type temporarily.
Wow, so you might have to completely shift your strategy based on the map you're running.
Pretty much, it's all about being prepared,
Right.
being ready to change things up.
Yeah.
And then there are the boss encounters.
Oh, yeah.
Those can be brutal. Bosses in Path of Exile, too, have some crazy abilities that can just wipe out your minions in seconds if you're not careful.
Yeah, some of those boss fights are legendary for their difficulty.
For sure.
Any tips for surviving those encounters?
Well, one thing you can do is focus on summoning fewer minions.
But make them really, really tough.
Right, so quality over quantity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like those beefed up zombies we were talking about.
Right, yeah.
Let them act as tanks, soak up the damage, while your damage dealers like the skeletons can focus on DPS.
Huh?
But sometimes even those tanky minions aren't enough.
Right, what then?
Don't forget about your own spells. Contagion, Arc, they can be really useful for softening up the boss,
Yeah.
interrupting key abilities, giving your minions a chance to breathe.
It's all starting to make sense.
Yeah.
So we got to be mindful of those challenges, prioritize defense when we need to, adapt to those map modifiers, and be ready to think on our feet during those boss fights.
Yeah, exactly. You're not just a summoner, you're a strategist.
Mm.
You're like a conductor of chaos, orchestrating the battlefield.
I love that. As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are the key things you want our listeners to remember?
I'd say the main thing is this build has a ton of potential,
Yeah.
but success in those higher difficulty levels relies on careful planning.
Smart gear choices and being able to adapt to whatever the game throws at you.
It's all part of the challenge, right?
Absolutely, and that's what keeps it interesting.
So before we move on to the final part, what are you most excited about with this build?
Honestly, I'm really intrigued by the whole Bind Spectre mechanic.
Yeah, me too.
There's so much potential for customization there. Like, you have this toolbox of undead abilities at your disposal.
What about you? What are you looking forward to trying out?
I think, for me, I'm really drawn to the strategic depth of this build.
Yeah.
It's not just mindless summoning.
Right.
You really have to think about your Ascendancy nodes, your support gems, your Spectre choices
Sure.
to overcome those specific challenges in the game.
Yeah, I think this build really rewards those players who like to experiment and think strategically.
That's a great point. But it also raises a really interesting question, doesn't it?
Oh, what's that?
Well, with all this talk about strategy and customization, how do we really push those core minion skills to their limits?
Are there specific support gems or ascendancy nodes that can make our minions even more powerful and even tougher?
That's a great question, and it deserves its own deep dive.